Welcome. This is one of over 200 talks on the history of Western art, and I've arranged these talks chronologically, starting with cave art, running right up to the present day. Feel free to dip in where you like or follow the course chronologically from beginning to end. This is section 15 on academic art, and this talk is on the French artist William-Adolphe Bouguereau. He was born November the 30th, 1825 in La Rochelle in France, and he became one of the most celebrated academic painters of his time. This self-portrait from 1886 shows him when he was 61 years old with his characteristic beard. Now, these artists were known as Pompier, and that term, l'art Pompier, was used at the time in some ways as a mocking term for academic painters whose work was regarded as overly grandiose, representing typically historical or allegorical scenes painted in a highly polished, technically proficient style. Where did the word come from? Well, it originates from the helmets worn by French firemen because they looked like the classical Attic helmets frequently shown in historical paintings. It's also a pun on the French word for pompous, and that reflected the contemporary views of the art as bourgeois, insincere, and overly theatrical. It's also now used to describe those artists at the time who were slavishly conventional. There were other artists who were described in this way, for example, Alexandre Cabanel. This portrait was obviously late in his career, and he dedicated it to Monsieur Sage, his professor. And it represents him as a mature artist at the height of his powers. Bouguereau created some 8 self-portraits through his life, each capturing a different stage of his career. Interestingly, this painting was a companion piece to a portrait of Elizabeth Jane Gardner, an American painter whom he would marry in 1896 when he was 71 and she was 59, following a 17-year engagement. And these two works, companion portraits, formed a pair and were considered by the artist to be a pledge of love to his fiancée. When he painted this, he was at the pinnacle of his career. He was president of the Society of Painters, Sculptors and Engravers, a member of the prestigious Institut de France, and his work commanded enormous prices, particularly from American collectors. But let's go back to near the start of his career. This was painted in 1850 when he was 25. It's Dante and Virgil in Hell, and is one of his earliest and most dramatic works. Now, he'd failed twice at this time to win the prestigious Prix de Rome, and he was determined to make a powerful impression at the Salon with this particular piece. He knew it would appeal to the judges, but it was again unsuccessful, although later in the same year, 1850, he won second prize for another work, although it's this work that is now the best known. What it shows is a scene from Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Specifically, it's the 8th circle of hell, where the poets Dante and Virgil, which you can see in the background, are witnessing a violent fight between two damned souls. Carpoccio, who was a heretic and alchemist, is being attacked by Gianni Schicchi, who had fraudulently claimed an inheritance by impersonating a dead man. Just to give you an idea of the way that the picture was received at the time, the critic and poet Théophile Gautier praised it, writing, quote, Giano Schicchi throws himself at Carpaccio, his rival, with a strange fury, and Monsieur Bouguereau depicts magnificently, through muscles, nerves, tendons and teeth, the struggle between the two combatants. There is bitterness and strength in this canvas. Strength, a rare quality. End quote. So this painting demonstrates his early artistic boldness. He was pushing aesthetic boundaries through exaggerated muscle structure, dramatic poses, stark contrasts, and it shows, I think, the influence of romantic artists like William Blake, Henry Fuseli, and Thomas Lawrence. Interestingly, this exploration of the terrifying and sublime represents a direction Bouguereau would take in his later career as he moved towards more idealized, serene compositions that would become his signature style. Now, a few years later, 1856, he painted The Dance, and it shows his growing mastery of allegorical painting in this neoclassical style. It's now at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. It's an ethereal composition. There's three figures floating among the clouds, three female figures in flowing drapery, white and golden yellow, one partially nude playing a tambourine. And the arrangement creates a sense of graceful circular movement, embodying the essence of dance itself. It was created during a pivotal moment in his career, shortly after he returned from Italy, where he'd been studying the Renaissance masters, and the influence of Raphael and Titian is evident, I think, in the harmonious composition and luminous colour palette. The art historian Fronia Wiesmann, who I'll be quoting a few times in this talk, she wrote a book called Bouguereau. She notes that this work established him as a painter who could create beautifully crafted large-scale mythological scenes, and these scenes appealed to the Second Empire taste in France for sensual but dignified classical subjects. It was this year, 1856, he began living with one of his models, Marie-Nelly Montchablon. She was 19 at the time, and they married 10 years later and had 5 children. He also painted religious paintings. This is Holy Family, painted in 1863. It shows the Virgin Mary with Christ child on her lap, the young John the Baptist. There's a serene landscape background. It was during the Second Empire in France, which ran from 1852 to 1870. And during that time, religious paintings like this were highly valued by the bourgeoisie, who sought art that reflected traditional values. So Bouguereau received numerous commissions for church decorations and religious subjects. A critic at the time, Charles Blanc, praised Bouguereau's religious works. He described the purity of line and sentiment and noted the artist brought a sincere devotion and profound respect to sacred subjects, treating them with both technical perfection and spiritual sensitivity. You can see here in this painting his characteristic smooth finish, meticulous attention to detail, particularly the delicate rendering of the children's skin and the carefully observed textures. Following year, he painted Bather, one of his most daring early works. It's now in the Royal Museum of Fine Art in Ghent. It was purchased immediately after it was exhibited. It's a provocative nude. It caused a sensation when it was first exhibited in Ghent. And Fronia Wiesmann wrote, "The painting was a spectacular success, shocking in its unabashed sensuality, yet painted with such consummate skill that critics could only marvel." What it shows is a young woman emerging from her bath in a woodland setting with discarded red garment, a striking contrast to her pale skin. There's a particular attention paid to the translucent quality of the skin and the subtle light playing through the foliage, again demonstrating his technical virtuosity. And again, during this period, Emperor Napoleon III and his court were promoting a more sensual aesthetic in France, and Bouguereau's nudes were particularly appreciated by wealthy collectors. And this painting shows his growing confidence in tackling subjects such as this. He created this work shortly after his first wife's death in 1863, during a period of personal turmoil. Despite his personal circumstances, his professional career was actually flourishing at this time, and paintings like this marked his emergence as one of the best known, most sought after artists of the Second Empire. This is 1869, The Knitting Girl. And this is typical of his genre painting or subject painting. This is a young peasant girl seated beneath a tree, absorbed in her knitting work. It's a serene rural setting. She's wearing modest clothing. And it's Bouguereau's idealized vision of rural life during what was in fact the rapid industrialization of the Second Empire France. At the time, an art critic praised the perfect execution, noting, "He elevates simple subjects through his technical brilliance and sensitivity to human expression." It's now in the US. It was bought by an American banker, Samuel Peck, in the 1870s, and this indicates a growing interest in America for French academic art, and in particular Bouguereau's art. And by 1869, he had established a significant American client base, and his works were selling for up to 30,000 francs. That was equivalent to several years' salary for the average French worker. It also illustrates, I think, his careful study of the Dutch Golden Age masters, particularly Vermeer. You can see his influence in the quiet dignity of the subject and the luminous quality of the light. A few years later, in 1873, he painted this well-known work, Nymphs and Satire. It's one of his best-known and best celebrated mythological works. It's a large canvas. It's now in America in the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown in Massachusetts. It's a scene of playful eroticism. There's 4 nymphs dragging a reluctant satyr to a woodland pool, and Bouguereau exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1873, and when he exhibited it, he added a verse in the catalogue from the ancient Roman poet Statius. It read, "Conscious of his shaggy hide, and from childhood untaught to swim, he dares not trust himself to deep waters." The renowned critic Gautier called it the greatest painting of our generation. He praised its technical virtuosity, its classical reference, and it shows Bouguereau's ability to combine academic precision with sensual subjects, and that particularly appealed to wealthy collectors. After this praise from the critics and its success at the Salon, it was purchased by an American collector, John Wolfe, for 35,000 francs. It was later displayed in the bar of the Hoffman House Hotel in New York City, where it became one of the most famous paintings in America, known to virtually every educated person in America at the time. But curiously, the painting disappeared from public view in 1901. It was purchased later, placed in storage by a buyer who was concerned about its offensive content, and it remained hidden until 1942, when the collector Robert Sterling Clark discovered and acquired it, ensuring its preservation for future generations. Another religious painting, Pietà, created in 1876. It's one of his most emotionally powerful religious works. It shows the Virgin Mary cradling the body of Christ, surrounded by mourning angels. And it shows his ability to combine Renaissance influence with his own distinctive academic style. It was exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1876, and it received considerable acclaim. The critic Albert Wolff wrote, quote, "Bouguereau's Pietà is a masterpiece of religious sentiment. The artist has succeeded in expressing the most profound grief while maintaining a noble restraint that elevates the subject beyond mere pathos." Bouguereau's treatment of this traditional Christian subject reflects the religious revival during the Third Republic of France, following the traumatic events of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871 and the Paris Commune. And the painting's emotional resonance spoke to a society that was seeking spiritual consolation during a period of national recovery. This is Nympheum, and it refers to an ancient Greek and Roman monuments that were consecrated to nymphs, and these were built often around springs. They were sometimes built in natural grottos, but later they were purely artificial. There's one in Hadrian's Wall, for example. However, despite this classical reference, it's clearly a way of displaying the female nude in a way that was almost acceptable, or I should say acceptable to some at the time. According to a writer for the Chicago Evening Post in the 1920s, Bouguereau's reputation in America was built upon his paintings of nudes. There's another of his paintings of nudes called The Bathers, which we saw in the Chicago Art Institute. And when it came up for sale, it received applause and was promptly bought for a New York salon for $18,000. Critics at the time in America often discussed whether his nudes were erotic or chaste, acceptable or in poor taste, but clearly wealthy patrons at the time loved them. This, another well-known painting by Bouguereau, is Evening Mood, painted in 1882. Shows his allegorical approach to the female figure. There's a solitary female figure standing on the shoreline at dusk, the crescent moon visible in the background. And Fronia Weisman wrote, Bouguereau's allegorical figures often represented natural phenomena, with this twilight figure embodying the transitional moment between day and night. So we should see it as allegorical, transition period. We're now, of course, in the 1880s. This was a highly productive period in his career. He'd already achieved significant commercial success. He was now president of the Society of French Artists, the organization which organized the annual Salon exhibitions. And this particular painting was acquired by a wealthy Cuban sugar magnate in the late 19th century, which explains why it's now in the National Museum of Fine Art in Havana. It's one of the few major works by Bouguereau in Latin American collections, because most of his works were purchased by American and European collectors. It shows his masterful handling of light, particularly note the subtle graduations of the evening sky and the luminous quality of the figure's skin. One critic at the time wrote, even Bouguereau's detractors, of which there were many, even those must admit his technical virtuosity in rendering the effects of light on flesh. This is the Birth of Venus, one of his most ambitious mythological works. It's 3 meters tall. It's currently in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. He's interpreting a classical myth showing Venus emerging from the sea on a shell surrounded by nymphs, tritons and putti. Bouguereau drew direct inspiration from his studies in Italy, particularly Raphael's The Triumph of Galatea and Botticelli's earlier treatment of the same subject. The painting was exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1879 and was acquired by the French state. The prestigious purchase by the state represented the official recognition of Bouguereau's status in the French art establishment. In some ways, this Birth of Venus represents the culmination of academic idealism, with its classical references, its distinctly modern sensuality, its appeal to the taste of the Third Republic. I should note that 16 years earlier, in 1863, Alexandre Cabanel, I mentioned his name earlier, achieved great success with his Birth of Venus, which was bought by Napoleon II for his private collection. Of course, the mythological scene is, like many of these paintings, is a pretext for a portrayal of a nude female figure, which, although it's idealized, is nonetheless depicted in a lascivious pose. And I said that there were many critics. One was Émile Zola, who denounced this ambiguity. Quote, "The goddess drowned in a sea of milk resembles a delicious courtesan, but not of flesh and blood, that would be indecent, but made of a sort of pink and white marzipan." End quote. But the work was popular and endured despite changing artistic tastes, and the painting was temporarily loaned to the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 1985, and in fact attracted record crowds, demonstrating the public appeal of Bouguereau's technical virtuosity and his classical themes. This is 1885, The Young Shepherdess, showcasing his idealized vision again of rural life. It's an Italian peasant girl. She stands barefoot in a pastoral landscape, looking back at us while tending her flock. It was based on one of the Italian immigrant girls who Bouguereau employed as models during his family vacations in La Rochelle. Remember the town where he was born. Another art historian wrote, "Bouguereau's Shepherdess represents a romanticized view of rural poverty. transforming the harsh realities of peasant life into elegant visions of rustic nobility. And his approach sharply contrasted with the more socially conscious rural scenes of contemporaries like Jean-François Millet. The proponents of these Pompier paintings sought to extol the virtues of the peasant class, so Bouguereau always depicts his peasant girls as poignant rather than threatening, wistful rather than resentful. It was bought by an American railroad magnate, Henry Edward Huntington, in 1905, the year Bouguereau died, and it reflects the enormous popularity amongst wealthy American collectors, and it was later donated by Huntington to the San Diego Museum. The Return of Spring, one of Bouguereau's most celebrated allegorical works. There's a nude female figure representing spring surrounded by a group of playful putti or cherubs. It emphasizes or exemplifies the way he synthesized classical mythology with contemporary academic techniques. It caused a sensation when it was exhibited in 1886. Émile Zola, although he was, as I've shown, generally dismissive of academic art, he did acknowledge that, quote, Bouguereau's technical mastery is beyond question, even if his vision lacks the vitality of nature itself, end quote. In 1890, the painting was vandalized while on display in a gallery in Chicago. A seminary student attacked it with a chair, claiming it was immoral. The incident made headlines across America and, ironically, increased public interest in Bouguereau's work. After careful restoration, it was acquired by a businessman, Francis Martin, who later donated it to the Jocelyn Museum in 1851. Another historian wrote, the Return of Spring represents Bouguereau at the height of his powers, combining flawless technique with poetic sensibility that transcends mere academic formula. The painting, incidentally, has enduring popularity, and it's a centerpiece of Jocelyn's European collection. This is the First Mourning, painted in 1888, during a period of personal tragedy for Bouguereau. He'd suffered the loss of his second son shortly before creating this powerful work. It's now in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and it's one of the museum's centerpieces since it was acquired. It's a biblical scene. It's Adam and Eve mourning over the body of their son Abel, who was murdered by his brother Cain. It's the first human death recorded in the Bible, hence the title, The First Mourning. It's a masterful composition. Adam is seated, holding the lifeless body of Abel while embracing Eve, who collapses in grief. The dramatic emotional intensity is heightened by the stark contrast between the pale body of Abel and the tanned skin of his parents. Another art historian wrote, it shows Bouguereau at his most emotionally powerful, combining technical virtuosity with profound human sentiment. The dramatic sky enhances the somber mood, the barren landscape emphasizes the desolation of the first parent's grief. The composition is a tight, triangular group focusing attention on the intimate family tragedy. It received significant critical acclaim for its emotional power when it was shown in the Paris Salon, and further cemented his reputation as one of the leading, if not the leading, academic painters of the time. This is Whisperings of Love, painted the following year during the height of his career. He was by then regarded as one of France's greatest living artists. It shows a young woman in classical white drapery on a stone bench while a cupid or cherub whispers in her ear. It's an allegorical scene representing the awakening of love and desire in youth. It shows his mastery of the female form, his ability to create idealized beauty. The pose is graceful yet natural. The cupid is rendered with anatomically precise despite its mythological nature. And one art critic wrote, he brings to classical themes a freshness and immediacy that makes ancient allegories speak to modern sensibilities. Incidentally, where I quote art critics, the critics, if you're interested, are named in the notes associated with my talk, which are freely downloadable from my website. The painting exemplifies his signature style, smooth, porcelain-like skin tones, and he achieved that through multiple thin layers of paint, which he carefully blended together, giving the skin this luminous quality, which contrasts with the subtle background landscape. He was at this time experimenting with more poetic, intimate subjects, alongside his larger mythological and religious works. And it reflects, I think, a shift in taste in the art market. When it was exhibited, a reviewer wrote, "Bouguereau continues to charm us with his technical perfection and his gift for creating images of timeless beauty that speak to the heart." Excuse me. This is the Shepherdess. A barefoot young shepherdess stands confidently with her staff, dressed in simple rural clothing. She looks out directly at us, engages us, creates an immediate connection that transcends the painting's 19th century origins. Again, this is another of the work that reflects his interest in rural French life, or at least his interpretation, idealization of rural French life, and his imagined ordinary working people. He did frequently travel to the countryside around La Rochelle, his birthplace, to find models and inspiration, but his to quote another art historian, his peasant girls are never coarse or vulgar. He ennobles his subjects while maintaining their essential character. The technical execution is characteristic of his matured style, meticulous attention to detail, particularly the texture of the girls' clothing. And it was created during a period of growing interest in rural subjects in French art. Partly, I think, a response to rapid industrialization and urbanization. It's looking back to the past. It was exhibited in 1889 in the Paris Salon, and another critic wrote, "Bouguereau gives us not just a shepherdess, but an emblem of rural virtue and natural grace that stands in contrast to the artifice of modern urban life." End quote. Of course, I just need to add that this was not what rural life was really like in France at the time. This is set in Paris on the south bank of the Seine, across from the Notre Dame, and we see a barefoot young woman sitting on a concrete bench, resting a violin on her lap. Interestingly, there was a photograph taken of this work before he sold it, and there was a bare stone wall behind the girl. And we believe this was painted out, this was changed by Bouguereau himself at the request of a potential purchaser. The painting, of course, reflects a moral message, and in this case, the violin is part of the moral message. It shows the virtue of labour in contrast to the ignominy of poverty and begging. The painting is dated 1890, but the 1889 has been seen in the underpaint, and Bouguereau often changed the date of a work, probably to reflect when he actually completed the work. It's owned by the Minneapolis Institute of Art until 2004, when it was auctioned by Christie's and sold for $735,500. The Broken Pitcher was completed in 1891 when he was 66 years old, still at the height of his technical powers. It's a young peasant girl sitting on a stone wall with a broken pitcher at her feet. It's traditionally been interpreted as a symbol of lost innocence or possibly lost virginity. So it's adding a layer of modern moral allegory to the seemingly simple genre scene. The girl's expression at the time was thought to be particularly captivating. It was interpreted as a mixture of regret, embarrassment, and resignation, and demonstrates Bouguereau's psychological insight and his ability to convey these complex emotions. As one art historian noted, Bouguereau's genius lay in his ability to combine technical perfection with genuine human emotion. In works like The Broken Pitcher, we see not just virtuoso painting, but authentic psychological portraiture." End quote. It's a carefully balanced composition. The vertical line of the well post contrasts with the seated figure. The bright green of the picture provides a focal point of colour against the more muted tones of the girl's clothing and the stone wall. It's typical of his late style. Which brings us to the last work, 1904, a year before he died. This is Ocean Nymph, one of his final masterpieces. You might be asking yourself by now, were some of his paintings just an excuse to show naked women? I believe the short answer is yes. This luminous oil painting depicts a nude ocean nymph, whatever that is, reclining on a shoreline, her pale form contrasting with the azure waves behind her. It exemplifies his lifelong dedication to classical themes and technical perfection, even as his health was failing. His personal life was marked by a profound tragedy. In 1856, he married, as I said, Marie-Nellie Monchablon, with whom he had 5 children. He outlived 4 of them, with only his eldest daughter, Henrietta, surviving him. In 1877, both his wife and infant son died, leaving him a widower at 52. And he found companionship with fellow artist Elizabeth Gardner, who he married in 1896 after his mother's death removed her objection to the union, which is why they were engaged for 17 years. He died on August the 19th, 1905, at the age of 79, in his hometown of La Rochelle. He suffered from heart disease. The final months were difficult, His house and studio in Paris were burgled in the spring of that year. And the modernist revolution was beginning to eclipse his reputation, but nevertheless he was honoured with a grand funeral procession and memorials in both Paris and La Rochelle. He was buried in Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris. He left behind a legacy of over 800 finished paintings. He was a profound influence on academic art, although, as I said, by 1904, the art world was profoundly being changed by artists like Picasso. At the time of his death, he was still president of the Society of Artists, and he remained committed to traditional artistic values to the end of his life. His legacy remains complex and contested. Although during his lifetime he was one of the most celebrated artists in the Western world and received countless honours, his influence on American art was particularly significant. And his reputation, though, quickly faded away after his death with the beginnings, the advent of modern art. And for decades, he was dismissed by modernist art critics. He was regarded as overly sentimental, technically rigid. However, contemporary recent reassessment has recognised his extraordinary craftsmanship and his contribution to art at the time. His paintings now command millions at auction. His influence on figurative art endures. And he mentored generations of students at the Académie Julian and the École des Beaux-Arts. So his influence remains. Thank you for your attention. I hope you continue to watch my series of 200 views of Western art. Thank you.